And just to kind of speak to the fact that they were very pro-Bitcoin and not looking into other things, this early tweet by the CEO, Brian Armstrong, this was in February 23rd of 2015, where he says, Ripple, Stellar, and altcoins are all a distraction. Bitcoin is way too far ahead. We should be focused on Bitcoin and sidechains. And so this is just kind of taking a look at where their mindset was early on, and people were more or less pretty happy with this take, and people nowadays look back at this and say, where is the Coinbase of the past? So we're going to take a look at where things started to go awry. And I think part of this has to do with the fact that the way that Bitcoin is structured, it is a protocol and it is difficult to change, and it takes time because developers are trying to take a very conservative and measured approach and test everything before rolling things out. They also want to maintain things like backwards compatibility when possible, and they want to avoid making it uneconomical for individuals to run nodes. And with all of that in mind, you have to look at things like scaling. And so many propositions were put forward to scale the network. However, many of them were also very controversial because they involve something called a hard fork, which is a non-backwards compatible upgrade or change to the network. And the problem with that when it comes to Bitcoin and having money on an ecosystem that everybody has to be updated in real time is if anybody doesn't update at the same time, then you can essentially be dealing with money that is not in consensus with everybody else's current state of the ledger. So you could be looking at a ledger that is not the same as anybody else's, and thus be spending money that is not really there or receiving money that is not really there. Furthermore, if you can do hard forks to the network at will very easily, then something like changing the supply cap of Bitcoin would feasibly be something that is not difficult to achieve, which would kind of ruin the proposition of sound money of Bitcoin itself. I digress. Let's take a look at the shifting sentiment of Brian Armstrong over time as controversial hard forks were proposed. And there were a few of them, and he supported every one unsuccessfully. So the first one was something called Bitcoin XT. This was proposed by a couple previous developers of Bitcoin, and Gavin Andreessen was one of them, and another one was Mike Hearn, were both involved. Mike Hearn famously rage quit Bitcoin, saying that it was a failed experiment, and moved on to work for R3, which was essentially a consortium of banks. So anyways, here's Brian Armstrong pushing for Bitcoin XT, which ended up essentially failing and not being adopted. Then Bitcoin Classic was put forth, and Brian Armstrong started to try and run them online and support that through Coinbase. However, once again, that was failed. It did not get consensus, and he was really pushing for it. This was kind of just a 2 megabyte block upgrade, but again, a hard fork, non-backwards compatible. And finally, there was SegWit 2x, which Brian Armstrong also supported. However, this one was a little bit more contentious than all of the others. Why? Well, because there was a closed-door meeting called the New York Agreement between a lot of different people. Barry Silbert helped put it together, but some of the main companies that were involved were Coinbase, Blockchain.info, BitPay, and Shapeshift, amongst others. And the narrative here was, hey, Bitcoin isn't working for our business models. Let's fire the core developers and install our own team of developers. However, it was done under the guise of, we need scaling now because we can't onboard new users and it's going to kill the protocol. So it was a way to supposedly compromise, but this compromise involved booting out everybody that was currently working on Bitcoin as a developer and installing a new bunch of developers. Now, this was very, very controversial at the time, and the problem with it is, if a number of companies were able to come together, completely switch out the developers behind Bitcoin and install their own, then what's to stop, even if this wasn't a nefarious thing in its inception, which that's arguable in the first place, but let's say they had the best intent and only wanted to further bootstrap the network and help it grow. Well, if they can go and they can kick out all of the developers, take over the protocol, and install their own, what's to stop the US government from then going to those companies and saying, you need to do this. You need to install all of these different things to mass surveil the populace via this protocol. And in that case, it would already be proven that they have the power to make changes to the code base. So it's a very, very scary precedent to set that companies could come in and make those sweeping changes. And it is very, very lucky that we narrowly averted that. So let's take a look here. I'll show you why. So here's something written by Brian Armstrong in February of 2016 as the block size and scaling debate was kind of starting to heat up. Title was, I'll bet you $5,000 that Bitcoin's first hard fork works out just fine. Now, a few months after this, Ethereum did hard fork, and there were some issues with that hard fork, and it wasn't really cut and dry right off the bat. And we won't dive too far into that, but this was the result of the SegWit 2x fork. Now, I should preface this by saying all of these companies backed out last minute, literally a day before this thing was supposed to go live. So there was a large user base that was pushing back against this. They did not want to kick out the core contributors. They did not want a new set of devs installed. They believed that hard forks were not a desirable outcome. And I believe it was BitMEX actually set up a futures market so that people could essentially allocate capital betting on which side of the fork would be more valuable. And leading up to this event, the SegWit 2x coin was at about a quarter of the value of a single Bitcoin. So it was clear that the market did not want it. And I believe mainly because of that, all of these companies backed out 24 hours beforehand. Now, the protocol was allowed to activate, and it's a damn good thing that all of these companies didn't push it live, because it failed spectacularly. As soon as it went live, the network essentially ground to a halt. Had that been Bitcoin, or had everybody decided that was going to be Bitcoin, well, essentially the network would have stopped functioning. And it was a huge bullet dodged here. The problem was they didn't test the code, and this is the whole thing behind the reasoning with Bitcoin Core taking that slow and steady approach, is because stuff like this can happen. Now, as I said, SegWit 2x was all about scaling the network, trying to allow more transactions every block, or more transactions per second, however you want to measure it. Well, it turns out that Coinbase wasn't already trying to optimize the space that they had available. SegWit had already activated early in 2017, in August actually, and it was available to be used, and Coinbase had not yet implemented it, even at the time of the 2x fork that they were pushing. They already weren't utilizing block space well. On top of that, they were not even batching transactions. For those of you unfamiliar, batching transactions, especially when it comes to an exchange like this, can optimize space like crazy, because so many transactions are happening. When somebody goes to withdraw from Coinbase, they were doing it as a single transaction on the blockchain, whereas they could have been waiting every 5, 10, 20 minutes, however much every block, and putting through a huge batch of transactions, all of those outputs and a single input, and they could have been saving so much space. You can see down here in the comments, they don't even batch transactions, and one of the users said nope, and they use about 58% of available block space because of it. So essentially, Coinbase was more or less bogging down the network single-handedly because of their poor utilization of the blockchain as is. So after the failure of SegWit 2x, they then said, oh, hey, we're going to start looking at adding SegWit and batching transactions now, I guess. Now, they didn't even end up adding SegWit until February 23rd, 2018. So, 8 months after it was available to be added? So they were really dragging their heels, and that put a pretty bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths.